Public transport was a very important part of city planning during the communist era in Central Europe. But how did things change after the fall of communism in 1989? How did countries treat, for example, intercity bus and train lines, now that cars were much more common? What about ongoing city projects, for example, for metros? And let's not forget the architecture of new stations and stops. So in this video, let's explore all that, while down here in our city of Altengrad, I will rebuild part of the oldest train station near the city center with very postmodern addition. Let's go. I introduced the communist-era city public transport back in episode 80, so let's not go into too many details now, let's just do a very quick recap. Public transport was a necessary part of city planning simply because workers would not be able to go to work otherwise. Central Europe was already, before communist takeovers, very densely covered by railways and in cities by trams. After the takeovers, modernist principles and cheap oil heavily led to buses, so removing trams and trolleybus lines, but emphasis on trains remained. High-capacity options in cities were needed, though, so metro systems were planned and some were built, although lack of funds painfully slowed down the construction, somewhere even preventing it, like in Warsaw or Bratislava. So by 1989, communist countries very heavily relied on overcrowded bus lines, somewhere trolleybus lines, with limited metro lines and the optimized, meaning reduced, tram networks. Not exactly ideal situation quality-wise, although the systems were there and operating. Now it's the 1990s, so what to do? Countries were in a tough spot. On one hand, there were big financial struggles. On the other hand, public transport systems had to function, otherwise the economy would collapse. At the same time, the systems had to be maintained, expanded to be made more efficient, and on top of that, there were plenty of inherited, unfinished projects that would simply cost way more money if left like that. So, in other words, money must have been found to spend on public transport. That is pretty much the 90s in a nutshell, painfully finishing the construction and maintenance debt of the previous era, fixing what should have been already done, repairing what was falling apart, or continuing what was already planned, but certainly not achieving everything. But even the actual service was suddenly questioned for various reasons. There can be found, for example, TV reports from Bratislava talking about the dire financial situation the city faced, even mentioning total closure of the city-operated public transport. It eventually did not happen, but the service was not great either. All countries switched to free market capitalism, and in the case of public transport, it meant privatization of transportation companies. This was related at first practically only to intercity buses. The large nationwide companies were split based on regions and sold off mostly domestically. In some regions, like in Poland, it meant heavy decrease in intercity bus service and quality, as some lines were just not profitable and the state gave free rein to the private companies. It also resulted in chaos of temporary bus stops for different companies. So overall, very early showing that the full private approach probably won't work. In contrast, Czechia, while privatizing bus companies too, quickly adopted the system of regional managing and ordering of intercity services. Basically, the regional government orders lines in some places and organizes a tender for private and state companies to enter. This meant that intercity bus lines were all right in the 90s, speaking from personal experience, although service did gradually start to shrink as rural or suburban areas started to rely more on cars and lines became too unprofitable. The new suburbs, however, were practically cut off and car was 100% needed. State subsidies for public transport significantly shrunk too. In some places or on some lines they disappeared completely, but somewhere it stayed, most typically in urban public transport. For example, Prague's system is heavily subsidized to this day, unlikely to change. Railway was heavily hit by disappearance of massive subsidies, which led to significant removal of passenger and cargo services across the region. However, this was mostly related to the small track, the small lines, that did not really see a lot of people. But on the other hand, the more important tracks, those actually saw much more focus in this time period, also because people suddenly could travel between the countries. Railways especially were in an unfortunate state, running very old vehicles already, tracks needed repairs, and important lines were either not complete or required significant upgrades. Perhaps that is partially the reason railway companies were not privatized. Private companies started to enter railways later on the busier tracks as a direct competition of the old state companies, creating the much needed motivation for improvements on those lines. In other places, much later, private trains replaced regional state lines entirely. What about building new things? What was actually done in the 90s? Typical example of inherited overdue projects that needed to continue or be fixed were the metro systems. In Warsaw, Poland, the first metro stations opened in 1995, after decades of painful planning and finding money. Around one half of today's M1 line was complete. The opened stations look quite utilitarian, very similar to each other. The architecture is simply following the engineering, but we can clearly spot the more typical design elements of the time, which we have seen before with the postmodern buildings. So the focus on polished metal overall, and somewhere on the platforms granite tiles, although not in each station. If we then compare these 90s stations with the rest of line M1 that gradually opened in the 2000s, then we can see that they do get a little bit more postmodernly designy, so it is likely the 90s ones are simply the product of their difficult time. Metro system for Bratislava was already cancelled in 1989, and with the city even considering shutting down public transport, metro idea was thoroughly completely done. In Budapest, new stations were opened right in 1990, so clearly similar story with Warsaw, inherited projects from the previous era, and exactly like in Warsaw, these stations are much more utilitarian. Berlin, of course, had an eventful decade in the 90s. As the city reunited, Berlin Wall fell, which also meant the Berlin transportation reunited. So tracks that were cut could have been refurbished and lines on them reopened, most famously over the Oberbaumbrücke. So focus was on the refurbishments and repairs rather than expansion. Although Berlin did add a couple of new stations, but on the outside we can spot very 90s architecture in some rare cases, like these entrance buildings that focus on metal, glass, unusual colors and shapes. And now finally for Prague. The Metro B line in the west was already started in the late 80s, and now it had to be financed and completed in the 90s. The city at first did not want to, but had no choice as the project was in a very advanced phase. The entire section, the so-called B5, is very typically early postmodern in each and every station. So we can see the polished metal very frequently, polished stone, metal covers on walls, lots of glass, since the stations are on the surface or directly below it, and different colors. Palm trees inside glass balls, sure, right here. One thing that postmodern architects really liked were classic roof shapes, so arches and the greenhouse-like tubes that sometimes appeared on old palaces or train stations and such. This part of line B is absolutely filled with the greenhouses, right above the covered palm trees, on a platform below a residential skyscraper, just the little ones on an entrance, or literally in the middle of nowhere, allowing sunlight to go down below. Bus station above the metro, greenhouse roof, of course. Station Luka from 1994 is quite different from the rest. It was built together with a shopping mall right across the street, connected by a bridge, and the architecture is once again very typical of the time. All steel, glass, and here and there combined with classic materials and shapes. The station itself, from the outside, almost looks like a factory, and it is similar to that Berlin metro entrance from the 90s too. But especially the mall next to it is really crazy. Very complex shapes, but surprisingly simple to navigate inside. It's actually just a roof over public levels with shops further inside. Obviously its current state is not great. Although the building is alright, it's just the cheap ads everywhere and a casino, which unfortunately plague many of these buildings from this era, as it's simply not seen as worth protecting, not worth spending time in. Not yet. Maybe, hopefully. Although judging by the new projects around, there's probably going to be pressure to just demolish it. I have even seen some proposals for a rework already. On the other side of Prague, on the other side of Metro B, another extension was done in the 90s, but this time as proper new project, and it shows. The 1998 station Paradise Garden is probably the most unique metro station in the city. It's built in a slope, so one side is open to sunlight, the other side faces the ground. It has 3 vertical levels, with trains arriving on the first in one direction, on the second in the opposite direction, and on the third levels there are some shops. From the outside, it is then covered by a huge curved metal and blue glass facade with many decorative elements. The station is really well kept, clean, polished, as good as new really, which is unfortunately absolutely not the case of the next 1998 station, the Black Bridge. It is much more utilitarian. On top it has the greenhouse, so no doubt about the time it was built in, but otherwise it's practically falling apart, and the sunken bus station nearby is probably one of the dirtiest and ugliest places in Prague. The entire station is going to be reworked in the future. The two stations are connected by a really nice bridge tube, which actually has a pedestrian path on top, accessed at the stations, or by stairs using these crazy spiral entrances that were actually repainted just a day before I went there, so the district clearly cares, which is very important for public transport projects. Now let's just take a quick look at a few buildings I wanted to show you from this time. The first, the Berlin Hauptbahnhof. That's actually also a 90s project, as it was started in 1995, finished in 2006. It's by far the largest project I'm showing you here, and it's also a very typical example of the German design of the time. It's super important structure, a landmark of Berlin even, so Germans would not allow some post-communist, postmodern experimentation, but went for proven West German architects. It looks much more recent than it actually is, which is somehow not uncommon for the German 90s. In Both, in Poland, there was the historical Kaliska train station. It was in a rough shape already in the 80s, as a lot of old buildings in Central Europe. It had to be closed down, and it was soon decided to tear it down and build a new train station instead. The new building is apparently supposed to quote the old one. I'm not exactly sure where, but it is undeniably a 90s postmodern project. There is the greenhouse on top, so that checks out. This project obviously touches that difficult topic of keeping old architecture, old buildings, trying to refurbish them for the new world. In this case, it was decided against it. This new building, by the way, was also already demolished in 2023, being rebuilt into something slightly else. In Liberec, Czechia, the same architect responsible for the Prague's Paradise Garden metro station designed a city center bus terminal. Greenhouse present, of course, so all is well, this time with a big clock nicely illuminated during the night. Very complex light metal structure with all sorts of cables and beams everywhere, making the structure look like some market tent. I've never liked this place in real life, to be honest, mostly because it's very dirty and way too crowded. It did not help that the tiny terminal got basically swallowed over the decades by much taller commercial buildings around, increasing the crowds, increasing the tight feel around. Still, if washed a little bit more frequently, it's not bad. And the last project, the train station in Bratislava's Petržalka. It was also a rework of an old station, this time much more mundane old building, since Petržalka station was practically irrelevant during the communist times, as it was located just a couple of kilometers from the Iron Curtain. After it fell, suddenly going by train into Austria, or even further west, was very real, so a big rework of this station was approved. Greenhouse roof right in the middle, check. Even rounded roofs over the platforms, unusual shapes, polished metal, playful colors, 90s postmodernism right there. Anyways, enough of that. There are still many topics to cover with public transport, architecture of course, and many, many more. So let's leave that for some other time. These examples showcased that the 90s were not only utilitarian wrap-ups of some old projects, but in a lot of cases proper continuations and also newly planned expansions. Public transport in this part of the world is a strategic piece of city development, despite some regions briefly forgetting that, despite countries and cities financially struggling sometimes. Now let's talk a little about what I built in our city. So after all of these real-life examples that I showed you today, but also in the previous videos about postmodern architecture, I think it's pretty clear where I took inspirations from. So most of the transportation buildings, but also, for example, the Warsaw University Library. I'm later going to be detailing some green roof in here, so there's that inspiration, and some other buildings that I saw here and there. Now obviously there's nothing like this in the workshop. I think I was saying this with the postmodern video that this time period is going to be really difficult in city skylines because the buildings are just not available. There are some American buildings here and there, but they are like skyscrapers. Sure, postmodern looking, but not exactly something I can afford to do in the city. But these kinds of transportation buildings, there's absolutely nothing like that. So it has to be completely done from scratch with procedural objects. So that's exactly what I did. Now, I obviously wanted to do the greenhouse roof right in the middle. It's going to have big clock in the center, of course, as well. Later, I'm going to add that. But yeah, how am I going to make that roof? So I took procedural objects circle, and because I know that it has just a couple of vertices, so it's a little low poly, I can copy its shape. And then I took this simple like a arch structure, like a gable roof structure for some stops or shelters. You can just download it from the workshop. It's a very simple shape. It's made of glass, of course. It's transparent, but actually not that transparent, as you can see, because, and you will see that in the cinematics even, or maybe you can see that over here in the time-lapse that, yeah, sure, it is transparent, but when you look at the building from above, you cannot really see down below due to the reflection. So that's just great for this purpose, because I'm not really going to detail the inside too much, but you will be able to see that there is movement with pedestrians down there. So that's actually quite interesting. And when you look at the building from some low angle, then you will see through it. The rest of the city, you will see through it. So that's also interesting. I'm kind of going on tangents. I completely forgot what I was talking about in the previous sentence. Well, doesn't matter. So, oh yeah, so I just downloaded that simple, or I already had that simple structure for the roof. I just, shaped it with procedural objects, turned it around with the specific angles because, I know the angles that the individual segments need to have between each other, and that's it. I just created the roof just like that. Now, it was not supposed to be just a greenhouse, but also some kind of structure, some kind of mass around. By the way, I just, destroyed a couple of buildings of the original train station. That was obviously going to happen sooner or later. That's kind of why I built that small cargo train station next to this one. It was always meant to be demolished in the modern times when that station no longer served any purpose. So that probably happened in Altengrad in already maybe the 70s or 80s, and now in the 90s it was finally completely removed, but not together with the rest of the station. The rest of the station was probably all right, so only this part was remodeled. Now, it also took some additional space. I got rid of a couple of trees over here. This building also has a parking garage, so there needs to be a new entrance to it. So it's overall somewhat densifying the area as well. Now, the rest of this building is made of a building that I already used before for the new government center. That's because the building that I used, like a radio building, I believe, of some sorts, but it's basically like a generic office, and it's very, very useful for these generic shapes of these sorts of glass buildings, because it's literally just a glass facade. You can nicely recolor it. I chose blue color because that's a very big contrast to the rest of the area, to the rest of the building, of the train station. So there it is. And then it was just distortions with procedural objects. And at the end of the day, this building, it doesn't really have that many objects in it. So it's actually very simple. But obviously the initial idea was kind of, trial and error. So it took some time. But the actual construction was not really that big of a deal. This is probably something that might have been done even in Blender. It wouldn't be that complicated because it's just basic colors. It's literally just blue, the outline white, but it's just flat colors. So it could have been some really simple texture. But obviously the problem is that I need to know exactly how it's going to fit with the rest of the city, with the rest of the train station. So I have to do it in the game. Well, anyways, this is the transition of the before and after, how it looks, how it looked before and now. And the idea for the station is also that it's not done, it's going to continue because, as you can see, the greenhouse roof forms some sort of a corridor, some sort of a pedestrian corridor through the area. So it connects that intersection, the tram intersection, which is also going to see some changes in the more distant future when we are going to maybe remove the cars from that area, make like a pedestrian plaza of some sorts, but no spoilers. I don't really have it figured out in details just yet. And here at the back, you can see that the tiling on the surface, it just ends, and there is some mud, people there crossing that street, going into the bus station, the very old 1950s bus station. So that's not exactly a very good connection either. So that's clearly telling us that there is some potential for future rework of this area. Now, by the way, this entire area is going to see huge rework because there is also a little further, there is the train depot. That's going to be removed. Well, spoilers, I guess. And, different things are going to be built there. So this entire place is supposed to then work together. And it's going to be like a nice combination of the 90s architecture and then gradually added in more decades with something more contemporary, let's say. So this is something very important the city needed. And I haven't really added any proper 90s building. Yeah, sure, I added some here and there, but smaller projects. So this is that super custom building that really needs to be here, right? The city really needed that, lore-wise or something like that. Well, anyways, so these are the cinematics. You can see the contrast, right, of the area. That's kind of why I did these cinematics of slightly zoomed out, so that you can see the blue building with the rest of the more warm-colored structures, old structures around, mostly with red colors with the roofs and some facades even. So yeah, this was a good choice actually, the blue color. Oh yeah, and the clock actually works on the front and at the back. Unfortunately, I just played the city at 12 at noon, so it's not moving. But yeah, at least in this little cinematic, you can see that it does. And yeah, there's quite a lot of car traffic in front of the very busy station. So maybe that's not exactly ideal, like I said. But anyways, that is going to be all for this episode. In the next one, we are going to take a look at housing, again, housing policies, how they changed in the 90s compared to the communist era. And we are going to build some new big residential area inspired by Berlin. Oh yeah, and this was Altengrad's episode 100. Yay, we made it. We made it all the way to 100. So here's to another 100 maybe in the future. Well, who knows? Anyways, guys, thank you for watching this one. If you liked it, then please do all the things below the video, clicking, rating, subscribing, sharing, and big thanks to channel members who are directly supporting this channel and me in what I'm doing. So huge thanks, guys. Take care. Goodbye.